There is a certain kind of person who begins to disappear just as they start to rise. They stop explaining themselves. They get quieter in rooms that used to draw them in. They step back from the noise, from the applause, from the constant pull of other people's opinions. And the world calls them cold, distant, changed. But what if they're not retreating? What if they're becoming something the world doesn't yet have a word for? Here's the thing no one tells you. When you start building something real, when you start doing the actual inner work of becoming someone you can respect, the closer you get to your own strength, the less you need from anyone else. And that shift, that quiet, invisible shift, will cost you things you thought you wanted. Friendships, approval, the warmth of a crowd that always felt like home. You'll lose all of it, gradually, almost without noticing, until one day you look around and realize the room is emptier than it used to be. And instead of panic, you feel something strange, relief. We're going to talk about that today, about why silence is not the absence of strength, but its truest expression, about why the path inward is the most powerful journey a person can take, and about the thing most people miss entirely, the truth that's hiding on the other side of all that noise. Stay with me, because this is the part that changes everything. Most of us grow up with a broken picture of what power looks like. We see it as presence, volume, the person at the center of every room, surrounded by allies, advisors, admirers. We think power is what fills the space around you, the hands that lift you, the voices that echo your name back to you like a reward. And for a while, it feels like that's true. You gather people, you build connections, you surround yourself with warmth, and it feels like safety, like proof that you're moving in the right direction. The more people who nod when you speak, you think, the more power you hold. But here's the part most people miss. The higher you climb, the more clearly you begin to see the cracks in that picture. Because what felt like loyalty starts to reveal itself for what it often really is, proximity to a fire that people enjoy standing near, not because they believe in the flame, but because they're cold and you're warm. And for now, that's enough. The Stoics understood this long before we named it. Seneca, writing from the heart of Rome's most powerful circles, watched it unfold around him every single day. Men who believed their influence was built on genuine connection, only to discover, the moment their fortune changed or their status slipped, that the room emptied faster than it filled. He didn't write about that as tragedy. He wrote about it as education. Because here's what that emptying reveals. Power was never in the crowd to begin with. It was never in the applause, the advisors, the smiling faces. Those things are reflections. They point back to something inside you, or they reveal the absence of it. And when the crowd leaves, what remains is the real answer. Pay attention to this. The moment you begin to understand that solitude is not a punishment, but a mirror, that's the moment your real education begins. There is a process that begins to happen slowly and without announcement when you start choosing your own direction with real conviction. It starts subtly. A friendship that used to feel easy begins to feel like work. A conversation that used to nourish you starts to drain something. You find yourself in rooms where the noise is loud, but the content is thin, and something inside you pulls toward the door, not in bitterness, but in something quieter than that. Awareness. You start to feel the difference between the people who are with you for the journey and the ones who are there for the destination. The ones who want to walk alongside your purpose versus the ones who just want to stand close enough to benefit from your light without ever carrying any of the weight. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The ones who leave loudest, the ones who complain the most when you become more selective with your time and energy, they are almost always the ones who benefited most from your openness. They weren't there for your discipline. They weren't there during the hours of doubt and failure and quiet perseverance. They arrived when the warmth was already present, when the fire was already lit. And when you stopped burning for their comfort, they left cold and called you selfish for it. This is the part that stings. Because when someone reframes your growth as abandonment, when they take your evolution as a personal slight, it creates a pressure to shrink, to explain, to apologize for becoming more of who you were meant to be. Don't. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in the private pages of his meditations, reminders that were never meant to be public. He wrote them because he needed to, because even at the height of power, surrounded by people who claimed to be loyal, he knew the truth, that the only person he could ever fully govern was himself, that the only approval worth holding was the kind that came from acting in alignment with his values, regardless of who was watching. And this is why it matters, because the filter that happens as you grow is not something you force. It is something that occurs naturally when you stop managing your image and start living your values. The right people won't feel threatened by your clarity. They'll be drawn to it. The ones who leave were never aligned with where you were going. You didn't lose them. You simply stopped hiding the gap. There is an image that comes to mind when people hear the word fortress. Stone walls, a moat, gates that never open. The idea of sealing yourself off from the world, retreating somewhere cold and unreachable. But that's not what an inner fortress is. The fortress the Stoics described, the one Marcus Aurelius returned to again and again in his writings, the one Epictetus built from the ground up, despite having nothing else, was not a physical retreat. It wasn't even a strategy. It was a state of being, a deep internal rootedness that meant the outside world could make noise, could push and pull and shout and accuse, and something within you would remain still, not numb, not indifferent, still, like a tree that bends in the storm but never loses contact with its roots. Building that kind of fortress begins with a question most people are afraid to ask. Who are you when there's no one watching? Not the version of you shaped by performance, by the need to be liked, by the constant adjustment you make to fit the expectations of a room, but the real version, the one that exists in the early morning before the world starts demanding things, the one that decides whether to act with integrity when no one is there to witness it. Because here's the truth that most motivational content won't tell you. The fortress isn't built in the dramatic moments. It's built in the small, quiet, invisible ones. In the daily decision to hold your ground when it would be easier to fold. In the practice of sitting with discomfort rather than numbing it. In the hours spent alone with your thoughts that you could have used to seek distraction instead. This is where everything changes. When you stop treating solitude as something to escape and start treating it as somewhere to go, intentionally, regularly, as a practice, your entire relationship with the outside world begins to shift. You stop reacting from need. You start responding from fullness. And there is a profound difference between those two things that changes every relationship, every decision, every moment of conflict in your life. Epictetus said it plainly. No person is free who is not master of themselves, not master of others, not master of outcomes, of themselves. That mastery is the fortress. And the fortress, once built, doesn't isolate you from life. It roots you so deeply in who you are that nothing outside of you holds the power to define you anymore. We need to talk about betrayal because it's one of the sharpest teachers on this path and one of the most misunderstood. Betrayal doesn't begin with a knife. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come from strangers or enemies or people who are obviously unsafe from the beginning. It comes from the seat beside you, from the person who knew the way in, not because they forced the door, but because you opened it. You trusted them. You let them stand close. You shared things that were private and valuable and real. More often, it's born of something quieter and more human. Fear, insecurity, the quiet threat that your growth represents to someone who hasn't yet done their own work. When your light makes someone else's stagnation visible, their instinct is not always to find their own light. Sometimes it's to extinguish yours. And you'll replay it. You'll go back through every conversation looking for the moment you should have known. The small signals you dismissed in the name of loyalty, the subtle shifts you noticed but chose not to act on. Here's what I want you to hear in that moment. Don't let the search for hindsight turn into self-blame. The fact that you trusted is not a flaw. But pay attention to this. The lesson of betrayal is not cynicism. The lesson is not to close off entirely, to stop trusting, to build a wall so high that nothing real can ever reach you. The lesson of betrayal is discernment. Seneca wrote that the man who has anticipated the coming of troubles takes away their power when they arrive. He wasn't talking about paranoia. He was talking about clear-eyed awareness of human nature, the kind that doesn't idealize people, but doesn't condemn them either. The kind that watches patterns more than it listens to promises. That pays attention to how someone acts when you have nothing to offer them. Betrayal, viewed this way, is not a wound that defines you. It is a refinement, a brutal, sometimes devastating refinement, but a refinement nonetheless. It strips away the illusions you were still clinging to. It reveals where your fortress had cracks, and it gives you the chance to rebuild, not from bitterness, but from wisdom. And that wisdom is hard, and it's earned, and it looks like a quieter person, a more selective person, a person who doesn't give out keys to their inner world just because someone smiles and says they're worthy of them. That's not coldness, that's clarity. And there is a profound difference. There is a kind of strength that the world rarely talks about because it doesn't photograph well. It doesn't make a good highlight. It isn't loud or dramatic or easily shared. It's the strength of the private self, the version of you that exists in the hours before anyone else is awake. That sits with failure when no one knows you're broken. That makes the choice to keep going not because it's been rewarded, but because something deeper than reward is guiding you. This is where leadership is actually built, not on stages, not in speeches, in the dark, in the doubt, in the relentless and invisible repetition of doing the right thing when no applause is coming. And here's where the mask becomes necessary, not as deception, not as a performance designed to fool the people around you, but as a structure, a way of carrying weight without letting that weight visibly crush you. And sometimes providing that requires holding things privately that you would otherwise need to release. Carl Jung said, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, it will tell you." The mask the powerful wear is not a lie. It's the result of having answered that question for themselves before the world got the chance to decide for them. It's a face that says, "I know what I'm carrying, And I've chosen not to let it collapse the people who are depending on me to stay upright. But make no mistake, the mask is not sustainable without the inner work beneath it. The mask works only when what's beneath it is real, when the silence it projects is not emptiness, but depth, when the calm it presents is not absence of feeling, but mastery of it. That's the difference between the leader who holds their composure until the moment they shatter and the one who has actually built something steady enough to last. We live in a time that treats silence as a failure of nerve. If you don't respond, you're avoiding. If you don't explain, you're hiding. If you don't defend yourself, you must have nothing worth defending. But here's the part most people miss. The person who does not react is not the person who lacks something to say. They are often the person who has learned something the reactive never will. That your silence is more powerful than your noise. That what you withhold carries more weight than what you broadcast. That the mystery of the unspoken often communicates more precisely than any string of words. People fear what they cannot read, and nothing is harder to read than someone who does not need to be understood. When you respond to every provocation, you hand the room a map to your emotions. When you rush to explain yourself after every misunderstanding, you signal that your stability depends on being correctly perceived. When you panic at criticism and scramble to correct it publicly, you tell the world exactly which buttons to press to move you. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." But bravery isn't charging in. Bravery is knowing when to hold back. You become someone whose rare words carry unusual weight. Not because you've withheld them manipulatively, but because you've trained yourself and the people around you to expect that when you do speak, it means something. There is no filler. There is no performance. There is only what you've actually thought through. And that, in a world drowning in noise, becomes rarer than gold. There is a truth about the climb that very few people warn you about before you begin. At first, the path feels shared. The early stages are crowded and warm. People cheer you on. They want to be near the energy of someone moving forward with intention. They celebrate the beginning of your rise because it hasn't yet threatened anyone's position, because you still need them enough that they feel secure. But as you keep moving, something changes. Not dramatically, not with any single moment you could point to. But gradually, quietly, the crowd begins to thin. The voices that once encouraged you become less frequent. The faces that once reflected your progress back to you start to look different. Sometimes with distance, sometimes with something harder to name. This is the part most people are not prepared for. Because we are told that success is a shared experience, that the higher you go, the more you will be celebrated, that genuine effort is rewarded with genuine recognition. And sometimes that's true, but not always. And never in the way you imagined when you were still at the base looking upward. The summit is quiet, not because it's empty, but because the people who reach it have stopped needing the noise to tell them they've arrived. Carl Jung wrote that solitude is a fountain of healing which makes life worth living. He didn't mean solitude as deprivation. He meant solitude as the specific, irreplaceable nourishment of being so deeply present with yourself that external validation loses its grip entirely. The summit tests whether you built yourself for that. It asks, can you sit here in this silence without collapsing? Can you continue without applause? Can you hold your vision clearly enough that it doesn't require an audience to remain real? Power doesn't corrupt. This needs to be said plainly, because the common understanding of that phrase, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, misses something essential about human nature. Power doesn't create the darkness in a person. It reveals what was always there. It removes the pretense. It strips away the performance of virtue that fear and social pressure once enforced. And what is left when those external controls are gone is the authentic interior, the actual state of the self that was always running the show beneath the surface. This is why the climb without inner work is always dangerous, not because power itself is toxic, but because it amplifies. Whatever you bring to it, it makes louder. If you carry unresolved fear into positions of influence, it becomes controlling behavior. If you bring unchecked insecurity, it becomes cruelty toward those beneath you. But here is the other side of that truth, the one that rarely gets spoken. When someone who has done the work arrives at power, something different happens. The amplification turns inward on the clarity they've cultivated, the patience they've earned, the deep-rootedness they built in silence and solitude and difficulty. That's what the inner work produces, not invincibility, not the absence of difficulty, but a self so genuinely understood and so genuinely aligned with its own values that external forces cannot redirect it against its will. That is the truest expression of power, and it begins not with acquisition, but with examination, not with reaching outward, but with going inward, not with accumulating, but with refinement. We started with a question: why do the most powerful people go silent? And I think by now you understand that it was never really a question about silence at all. It was a question about where strength actually lives. It doesn't live in the crowd. It doesn't live in the applause, the approval, the constant company of people who reflect your worth back to you like a mirror you need to keep looking into. Those things are real and human and sometimes beautiful, but they are not the source. The source is quieter than that. It lives in the practice of meeting yourself honestly, in the place where no one else can go with you, in the discipline of holding your ground when it would be easier to bend, in the slow, private, unglamorous work of becoming someone whose value doesn't collapse when the room goes quiet. The people who go silent as they rise are not retreating from life. They are moving more deeply into it, into the part of life that is actually theirs, that belongs to no one else's expectations, or judgments, or projections. They have learned what Epictetus knew from the beginning, that the only truly free person is the one who is master of themselves, not master of outcomes, not master of other people, of themselves. And once you understand that, once you really feel it, not just intellectually, but in the way it changes how you move through a room, how you respond to criticism, how you make decisions in silence without needing anyone's permission, everything is different. The noise doesn't stop. The world doesn't become less demanding. People don't suddenly stop testing your limits or projecting their fears onto your choices. But you become something that all of that noise cannot move, not because nothing reaches you, but because what you've built inside is finally stronger than what anyone outside can shake. That's not distance. That's not coldness. That's not the absence of feeling. That is the full, quiet, unshakable presence of a person who has finally come home. Because the silence doesn't lie. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't perform. It just holds you in the truth of who you are, without apology, without noise. If what you heard today landed somewhere real in you, if some part of this recognized itself, there's more waiting. The other videos on your screen will take you further. This is Stoic Mode, where strength begins in stillness. Thank you for being here.